Section 1 of Beekeeping Do's and Don'ts. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Beekeeping Do's and Don'ts by Tickner Edwardes. How to become a beekeeper. To the man who, without any previous knowledge of the subject, has made up his mind to start beekeeping, it may well seem that the obvious and necessary step is to obtain a hive or hives of bees. My advice to him is, don't. As a matter of fact, no greater mistake could be made by the complete novice. It would be much more accurate to say that getting bees is about the last step which ought to be taken towards making oneself a beekeeper. There are many things that should be carefully considered before actual ownership in bees is adventured. First, in what sort of district do you propose to keep them? Bees will generally manage to keep themselves in almost any locality, but they will not be able to provide their owner with surplus honey unless the country surrounding the apiary is fairly rich in nectar-yielding plants. If your hives are to be stationed near fruit orchards or near sheep farms where flowering crops are annually raised for sheep feed, or near heather-clad moorlands, the bees will probably do very well. A situation combining the three would be ideal for honey production. But it should be remembered that bees do not ordinarily forage more than a couple of miles at the farthest from their hives. Also, it must be recognised that ordinary garden flowers are practically useless to bees when honey making, so that a suburb with miles of such gardens on every side, glowing with all sorts of bright blossom, may, nevertheless, prove an exceedingly poor honey district. All this frankly stated, however, it is wonderful what a good strain of bees will sometimes accomplish even in the most unlikely situation. I am tempted, therefore, to say that the most experienced bee-master cannot determine in advance exactly what a given district is capable of. The only sure way is to set up a hive or two for a season and judge by results. Then, secondly, an important early consideration is what variety of honey bee to obtain. There may be two beekeepers in a village, the one securing year after year a good return from his hives, and even in poor, bleak, sunless seasons doing not so badly. The other will be a pretty constant prey to ill luck. His bees never do as well as his neighbours. He loses many stocks in the winter, and he often complains of disease among his hives. A very great deal of the difference in results secured by these two men is due to the fact that the one believes in keeping only bees of a high-blooded, vigorous strain, while the other is content to go on season after season with his ancient scrub stock, inbred, until it has lost all racial stamina, and is ready to succumb to the first microbe that happens along. Successful honey production depends largely on the kind of bee kept. It does not greatly matter whether the bees are Italians or Dutch or Carniolans or Browns, which nowadays are more or less a blend of the other races. But the vital thing is, they must be good of their kind, or no amount of management will work them up into colonies strong enough in population to exploit to the full the honey flow when it sets in. And thirdly, our bees must be kept in the right sort of hives. The old straw skep is very pretty, and there is no gainsaying that in bumper seasons a good yield of fair quality honey may be obtained by its use. But under no conditions is it possible to secure as much as half the harvest with skeps as with hives of modern design, while the skep is at all times simply unmanageable. Bees, to be profitable, must be housed in well-made, modern, movable comb hives. There are many manufacturers of beehives of high repute, and practically any one of them will supply a right article if the purchaser be not unduly intent on cheapness. As a rule, it is a good policy to select a type which is one of the dearest, with all the simplest and plainest on the list. But the main point to insist on when choosing a hive is that it should have double heat-retentive walls to the brood nest or lower story, and if it have a double floorboard, all the better. Single-wall hives are unsuitable for wintering bees in this country. There is still another point to consider before we rush into ownership of a colony of bees, and that is twofold. What time of year is the best wherein to make a start in beecraft? And ought one to begin with a stock or a swarm? There are advantages and disadvantages both ways. An established stock of bees may be bought at any time of year, though the novice should never do so except towards late spring, when the dangers and difficulties of bringing the bees safely through the cold, unproductive season are happily over. A stock will cost more money than a swarm, but it will have the advantage of coming into immediate profit. Obtained, say, in March or April, and suitably treated, as will be detailed hereafter in its place, the owner may look in a fair season for a yield of honey of probably 50 pounds in weight, and very possibly a good deal more. But for many reasons, even if he is able to meet the extra outlay for purchasing stocks, the beginner is strongly advised to start himself in the career of bee-master by obtaining swarms. A stock may have its combs old, its queen past her prime, its hive rotten, and is more likely to bring disease of some sort with it than a swarm which consists of bees alone. The swarm may not have a young queen, and it may not be healthy, but at least it can be established in a brand new dwelling which it will be feverishly eager to furnish with new, clean combs from top to bottom. Moreover, if the season be an ordinarily good one, a swarm secured early in the month of May will most probably not only establish itself in the new hive and store good provision for the succeeding winter, but it may generally be counted on to provide its owner with a fair amount of surplus honey into the bargain. Assuming, therefore, that the beginner has made up his mind to start with a swarm, his first step should be to obtain from a reliable bee appliance dealer the articles now to be described. A good double-walled hive. Nearly every manufacturer lists what is called a WBC hive. Until the novice has gained such experience as will entitle him to have his own opinions as to the relative merits of the many good hives upon the market, he is advised to go in for a WBC. He should order it to be sent painted and properly furnished with 10 brood frames filled with wired foundation, a queen excluder, a rack of sections, and a rack of shallow frames, both sections and shallow frames having full sheets of foundation. The brood frames go into the lower chamber of the hive, and it is here the swarm will set up its domestic quarters, and where the queen, or mother bee, will live and breed. The queen will not be wanted at all in the upper stories, the honey racks of the hive. Ordinarily she will not venture away from her nursery below, but if she become cramped for egg-laying space, she is very likely to invade the upper regions. The queen excluder just mentioned is a device intended to prevent this. It consists either of a sheet of zinc perforated with slots or a griddle of wires, which allows the smaller worker bees to pass up and down, but intercepts the fuller-bodied queen. Thus the sections or shallow frames are kept entirely for storage purposes. In addition to the above enumerated articles belonging to the hive, the prospective beekeeper will require the following tools. A smoker. This is best described as a kind of metal funnel with a small leather bellows attached. Some sort of material which will smoulder, such as brown paper or fustian rags, is set alight in the funnel, and the smoke thus produced is employed to subjugate the bees and induce them to allow their hive to be opened without reprisals. A bee veil. The novice is advised to get one of these of the finest black silk net procurable, and to wear it habitually when working among his hives. As a matter of fact, the veil will not actually be needed 9 times out of 10 that it is put on. Many beemen never wear veils, and no harm may ever come of the omission. But the 10th time it is quite possible one may get stung in the eyeball, and this may easily lead to loss of sight. That is a risk not worth running to save the very little trouble of putting on a veil. Such a veil as I recommend is almost imperceptible in use and will last for years with fair treatment. Gloves should never be worn, as they interfere seriously with the beekeeper's work. If a little vinegar be rubbed on the hands before a hive is manipulated, there is practically no risk of stinging. In any case, you will soon get to think nothing of a sting or two on the hands. A few simple tools may be procured at this time, such as a painter's scraping knife, a triangular scraping tool, and a good strong screwdriver, all useful in cleaning hives and dealing with honey racks. To these may be added a few turkey wing feathers, a small bottle of vinegar, a jackknife, a box of matches, and a tin with a tight-fitting lid containing an 18-inch square of calico moistened with diluted carbolic acid, and the whole may be kept in a partitioned box with a handle, rendering it easily portable. There is practically nothing else that need be provided in the outset, except it be a bee garden jacket with collar buttoning up to the neck and cuffs with elastics to them. This will necessarily be kept in the bee shed, and will prove both a comfort and a convenience, as well as an aid to cleanliness. When working among flying bees, one's clothes are liable to get spotty at times. End of section 1. Section 2 of Beekeeping Do's and Don'ts by Tickner Edwardes. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A swarm in May. Let us suppose the time is early May, and a crate containing the hive and other articles which we ordered a week ago now stands on our premises ready to be unpacked. I say a week, but it is much more likely to be a month or even longer at this busy time of year. A maxim for the beekeeper in these modern days is always to order up supplies well in advance of the date they are likely to be needed. Very little ingenuity will be called for in fitting the parts of the WBC hive together. Their order will more or less suggest itself. The stand, with legs attached, may or may not be separate from the floorboard. The two cases, an inner and an outer, forming the brood nest are, however, always separate in this pattern of hive. They should be got into place on the floorboard and the 10 brood frames inserted in the inner case side by side. These frames, unless otherwise ordered, will be of the standard size as fixed by the British Beekeepers' Association. That is to say, they will measure 14 inches in their length and 8½ inches in their depth, and their top bars, whose ends rest on the sides of the hive, will be 17 inches long, all outside measure. It will be seen that the frames are filled with thin sheets of beeswax with a fine hexagonal pattern impressed into their surfaces on both sides. These sheets act as foundation for the future comb which the bees will raise on them, using the hexagonal pattern as bases for the comb cells. The foundation, it will also be noted, is reinforced by cross strands of fine wire. When the frames are put into the brood nest side by side, they are held 1½ inches apart from centre to centre by tin cross pieces at either end, and they are suspended by their lugs so that they do not reach the floorboard below, nor do they touch the sides of the hive by exactly 1/4 inch. The object of this rather complicated furniture of the brood nest of the modern hive is to provide for the ready removal of the combs at any time needed. The beekeeper can lift out and examine any of the frames whenever he pleases, whereas the old skep or plain box had its combs fixed by the bees to its top and sides, and there was no possibility of doing anything with it. Now, if you are preparing the hive for the reception of the swarm which you have bespoken, and which may be expected very shortly, nothing more should be put on but the squares of fabric called the quilts, and the roof over all, when the hive may be at once stationed in the position in the garden which it is intended to occupy permanently. Be sure that it stands perfectly level. The swarm may be ordered from a dealer, or it may be obtained from a private beekeeper, either in the neighbourhood or at a distance. If from a dealer, it will arrive in a swarm box, which is a square wooden receptacle specially constructed for travelling, with perforated zinc panels to allow of ample ventilation. Directly the box arrives, stand it in a dim corner for an hour or two before opening, to afford the bees time to recover from the excitement of their journey. It is advisable also to give them a bottle of sugar syrup in case they may be in need of food, as hungry bees are difficult to handle. Make the syrup in the proportion of 5 pounds of white cane sugar to 3½ pints of water, bringing it slowly to the boil while constantly stirring. Let it boil 2 or 3 minutes, then pour into a glass jam jar, filling the jar right up to the brim. It may be given to the bees when cooled down to about blood heat. Lay a slip of flat tin over the mouth of the jar in contact with the syrup, then turn the whole upside down and stand it upon the perforated zinc in the swarm box lid. Now slide out the tin without disturbing the jar, and it will be found that the syrup will not run out, but that the bees can readily suck it through the holes in the zinc. The swarm can then be hived in the manner detailed on page 17. If, however, you have arranged with some local beekeeper to purchase one of his swarms, the bees will be brought to you, or you will have to fetch them in a skep or some such receptacle, soon after sundown of the same day on which the swarm issued. This arrangement is usually a very advantageous one for the novice to make, as a visit paid to the beekeeper, with the object of bespeaking a swarm, can easily become the initial step of an acquaintanceship destined to prove of enormous value both in the present and for the future. No chance of scraping such an acquaintance, nor of improving it from time to time, should be allowed to slip. A beekeeper of extended experience, really loving his work, will teach the beginner more in a day than he could learn from books in a month. If, therefore, you have the hive all ready for the swarm, and no news of the latter has reached you as yet, your best plan is to take a stroll round to the bee garden and find out how things are faring. On a fine morning in May, the chances are that the bee master will be very busy indeed, and more than disposed to accept any help proffered him. You will find that you have come in the nick of time. Just slip on your bee veil, making sure that it tucks into your coat collar all the way round, and follow your friend to his next task. He is going to put a new super on a stock, he tells you, as he bends down to light his smoker. The nozzle of the smoking apparatus is pulled off, and a cartridge of corrugated brown paper is inserted, smouldering end first. The bellows are gently worked until a steady full jet of smoke escapes from the funnel. The bee master goes to the hive and sends 2 or 3 quick, dense puffs into the entrance. He steps back to wait a minute or so. If he had only been going to supply an additional honey rack to that already on the hive, he explains, he would not have smoked the stock at the entrance at all, but have trusted to gentle, deft manipulation to get the new rack between the old one and the brood nest before the bees realised that their home was suffering invasion. But here he wishes to examine the brood box, as he fears that preparations for swarming are being made, and his design is to frustrate the intention of the bees. He does not immediately open the hive after injecting the smoke, because it is necessary to give the bees time to fill themselves with honey, which they will always instinctively do on being alarmed. The effect of the honey is to quieten and reassure the stock, and to render them disinclined to sting. The smoke, be it noted, does not really subjugate, but merely frightens the bees. The bee-master now removes the roof of the hive, and then levers up and takes away temporarily the honey rack already upon it. This discloses the queen excluder with worker bees crowding up through it. The excluder is gently removed, beginning at one corner, and the top bars of the 10 brood frames are now exposed. The master inserts a finger beneath each end of the rearmost frame and lifts it carefully out, smothered on both sides with bees. You never saw the inside of a hive before? He surmises. Well, all these little bees are workers or undeveloped females, and these larger bees are drones or males. The queen is the only fully developed female in the hive, and all the eggs are laid by her, so she is the mother of the whole colony. We shall find her in a moment. While he speaks, he is lifting out and returning the frames one by one, scrutinising each narrowly on both sides. Every now and again he points out to me something like an irregular acorn pendant from the edge of the comb. This he cuts off and deposits in a small tin box. Queen cells, he explains. The hive gets overcrowded, and from that cause or some other, the bees decide to swarm. But first they must prepare for the future. The old queen always goes away with the swarm, so it is necessary to provide a successor for her. This is done by building queen cells and raising in them young queen bees. Though the worker bees are raised in these little cells in the combs, and the drones in the same sort of cells, only a little larger, each queen has one of these big royal apartments all to herself. Only one queen is needed and will be allowed to live, but several are raised so that there may be no chance of the hive becoming queenless. When the first of the young queens is nearly ready to emerge from her cell, the swarm goes off. Now, if I want to prevent the hive swarming, I go through the brood nest, as I am doing now, destroying all the preparations the bees have made. I also give them as much extra room as I can. The result is generally that there is no swarm. He has examined all 10 of the brood frames now, and returned them to their places in the hive. The excluder zinc goes back over the frames. Then the new empty rack, either of section cases for comb honey or shallow frames when extracted honey is being worked for. Then the old half-filled rack, still crowded with bees, goes on over the new one, and the hive is closed up, snug and warm again. The new rack has been put between the brood nest and the old rack, because it is found that the bees take to it more readily in that position than when it is put on the top. Bee nature abhors a vacuum. But sometimes, continues the bee-master, surveying his trim rows of busy hives with a critical eye, nothing you can do will prevent bees swarming. That hive over there now, I cut out all the queen cells a week ago and gave them plenty of fresh super room. But they have probably raised more cells, or there was one I missed. Anyway, they look very much as if, yes, they are going to swarm now. You shall help to hive your own bees. The novice never forgets the day he first sees a swarm of bees issue. It is such a tumultuously joyous proceeding. The bees pour out of the hive entrance in a living stream and mount into the air, every bee singing her loudest. In a minute or two, the whole sky seems full of flying bees, darting hither and thither, and the sound of their voices has risen to a perfect uproar. And then, sooner or later, the multitude begins to concentrate, generally in the upper part of some tree or bush. You make out a little dark knot of bees clinging together on a branch just overhead, and as you look, the knot doubles its size. The whole singing concourse is now setting this way from all quarters. Presently the last bee has attached herself to the cluster, and the bees hang from the branch in a big oval, or sometimes cigar-shaped mass, gently swaying in the sunshine. A strange quiet falls on the bee garden. You watch your friend as he approaches the suspended swarm, a skep in one hand and a board in the other. He holds the skep just under the swarm, and with a quick, strong jerk to the branch, precipitates the whole company into the skep, claps the board over it, then gently turning the hive over, stands it upon the ground just beneath the tree where the swarm pitched. He waits a few seconds, then lifts the front of the skep, propping it up an inch or so with a stone. At once the entire multitude, as it seems, rushes out, some climbing up the outside of the skep, but the greater part getting on the wing with a frantic song. The bee-master watches the manoeuvre unconcernedly. "If the queen comes out," he says, "the swarm will go back to the branch, and we shall have to hive it again. But if she stops inside, as I think she is going to now, all will be well. In a few minutes most of the bees will go back to her, to start a great cluster for wax making, while others will go off into the fields to look for provisions for what they think is their new home. But it isn't their new home. They are bought and sold. We must leave them here until sunset, when the foragers will all be in for the night, and then we will carry them round and put them in your new hive." In the red light of sundown that evening, the bee-master may be seen gingerly carrying the closed skep down the lane towards your dwelling, the bees as yet unaware that anything extraordinary is happening to them. Arrived at their destination, they are set carefully down on the ground hard by, while the new hive is made ready for their reception. The necessary preparations consist merely of opening the entrance of the hive to its fullest width and providing an extension to the alighting board. This extension may be conveniently contrived by a good-sized box lid sloping gently to the ground, a piece of old sheeting or the like being stretched over all by means of drawing pins, covering both the lighting board and addition. Now, the smoker having been got ready, a few quiet puffs are blown into the skep just to warn the slumberous inert crowd that something unusual is going to happen. Then the whole mass of bees is poured out upon the cloth so that some of them at least are near the hive entrance. Very few of the bees will get on the wing, but the entire company will soon be trooping up into the hive like first-nighters crowding into a theatre. In 10 or 15 minutes the last stragglers ought to have disappeared inside, and the temporary extension of the alighting board may be removed. But if the operation has been undertaken rather late, and dusk has fallen before the bees are all in, it may be necessary to hasten their movements by a little smoke puffed at the hindermost. Otherwise, a good many of the bees may remain outside all night. Under normal conditions of weather, a good, strong, healthy stock, properly hived in this way upon 10 standard frames fitted with full sheets of foundation, will need very little further attention for the rest of the season. The swarming bees will have brought with them in their honey sacs sufficient provender to last them 4 days, and by the expiry of that time, provided the weather has been reasonably favourable, the home-keeping bees will have built comb, and the outgoing bees will have gathered nectar enough to give the colony a start in life. But if a period of cold, wet weather should set in immediately after the hiving of the swarm, it may be necessary, and is generally desirable, to administer food, either in the form of a frame of sealed honey, which is best of all, or by means of the syrup bottle, as detailed on page 10. Provided the weather conditions remain good, however, it is quite possible that in 10 days or a fortnight's time the swarm will have made such progress with the building of the combs of its brood nest that it may be desirable to give it a rack of shallow frames or sections. These racks will have been supplied with the hive ready furnished, and will only need placing over the brood nest when needed. But in future the beekeeper will make up his own racks, which he will easily do, with good examples before him. Having now seen the novice comfortably started with his swarm in May, the best of all ways to commence beekeeping, we will turn back to the beginning of a typical calendar year in the life of a modern honey producer, and go through it month by month to the year's end, endeavouring to deal with all its difficulties and equivocal points by the way. End of section 2. Section 3 of Beekeeping Do's and Don'ts by Tickner Edwardes. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Spring and Summer Management. The honeybee's year properly commences at what old country folk call the turn of the days. That is to say, soon after Christmas time, when the mornings and evenings have just begun to draw out, albeit imperceptibly at first. It is then that the queen, hitherto snugly laid up in the heart of the warm, drowsy cluster of worker bees, feels again the call of nature, and the first few eggs are deposited in the inmost cells of the central brood frame, soon to be hatched into tiny, glistening white grubs. These grubs are fed by the worker bees mainly with a thick white substance from their own mouths, not inappropriately called bee milk. The grubs reach full size, completely filling their cells in 5 or 6 days' time. They then spin themselves silken cocoons, and the worker bees seal them up in the cells, where they remain quiescent for another week or so. In about 3 weeks from the day the egg is laid, a little longer in the case of the drones or male bees, the fully developed young bee emerges from the cell, having gnawed its way through the edible capping, and at once mingles with the throng in the hive. These young worker bees, however, do not normally leave the hive to forage for nectar until after the first fortnight of their lives. During this first fortnight they remain indoors, where they are occupied with the nursery work of the colony and the comb building. After this age, and for the rest of their lives, they are engaged in the daytime almost exclusively out of doors. The life of a worker bee extends from about 6 weeks in the height of the summer season to 4 or possibly 5 months, when they are lying up in a semi-dormant state throughout the winter. But the honeybee does not hibernate in the strict sense of the word. Though a beehive shows little or no signs of life while the weather remains really cold, the first mild break in the wintry conditions will bring out a cloud of flying bees round every hive. This happens every warm sunny midday during the whole of the winter, the bees coming out for the purpose of easing nature, a function which never takes place within the hive in the case of healthy bees. This cleansing flight, as it is called, should always be carefully watched for by the beekeeper. Towards noon on every really mild winter's day, each stock should have its period of flying activity, however brief. If a hive obstinately resists the call of the sunshine when the rest are eagerly disporting themselves, a corner of the quilts should be lifted for a moment or so, just long enough to make sure of the state of things within. The bees may be stupefied through starvation, or they may be even dead, and so beyond all help. But if it is merely a case of stupor due to inanition, they can usually be saved by warming a little honey or syrup and letting it drop gently among the torpid bees. When the food has roused them, a bottle of thick, warm syrup may be given and renewed so long as it is rapidly taken down, then followed by a regularly maintained supply of sugar candy, which is the safest form of artificial food during the close season. But while these cleansing flights are not too long intermitted, the beekeeper is strongly advised never to interfere with his bees during the close season. Don't hesitate to open a hive whenever it seems necessary, but don't take unwarranted risks in this way merely out of curiosity. Untimely manipulation of a stock during the early months of the year may mean chilled brood and the progress of the colony disastrously checked just at the time when steady continuous progress towards strength of population is most vital. Most beginners at beekeeping seem to take it for granted that bees have to be fed artificially at some time or other during each year, or they will not thrive. As a matter of fact, my own sugar bill for bee food during many years past has not amounted to 6pence per hive annually. This is because my bees have always been kept in an exclusively sheep farming district, where early large bee populations are not necessary. If my stocks reach good strength by the beginning of May, they will be well in time for the main local nectar flow, which is derived almost entirely from crops grown for sheep feed. But where the apiary is stationed in a fruit orchard area, it will pay to stimulate early breeding by the right system of artificial feeding. The syrup used for this purpose should be fairly thin, 7 quarts of water to each 20-pound lot of sugar being employed. The whole should be boiled for a short time and administered to the bees by the means of the bottle feeder, which allows of graduated supply. The gist of the idea is to permit the bees to take the syrup in regular but restricted quantity, as nearly at the rate of a natural nectar supply as possible. The syrup should never be given at such a rate that it may be stored in the combs. Many beekeepers add vinegar, salt and an antiseptic to these syrup foods, but in my own practice I do not do so, and have never been able to trace any resultant harm to the omission nor advantage in their use. The vital thing to remember in all spring stimulation by artificial methods is to make the supply continuous. Once started, it must be steadily maintained until the natural sources of nectar are available, or a serious check to the stock may occur. Don't feed at all for spring stimulation unless you are prepared to go on with it. In the south of England, as soon as March is well in, a short period of fine warm weather may be expected any day. It usually lasts for a few days only, so no delay should occur in taking advantage of it. This warm, bright interlude should be watched for, and the chance seized for making a start on the annual spring cleaning of the hives. This process is very necessary, as during the long close season of winter and early spring, there is always an accumulation in a hive, which, for sanitary reasons, should never be allowed to remain over the summer. The best way, where several stocks have to be dealt with, is to have a spare hive completely ready for occupation, and to transfer your first stock to this en bloc. The hive thus liberated is then cleaned and repainted, when it is used to house the second stock, and so on. Even when you are the possessor of only one colony of bees, this is still the best plan, although the spring cleaning operation can be carried through quite efficiently by having a temporary receptacle into which the frames of the brood nest may be placed while the hive is being scraped and cleaned. But the disadvantage of this plan is that the young maturing brood in the frames is more exposed to the risk of chill than when the frames are merely transferred from the old soiled hive to the new clean one, and the quilts expeditiously returned to their place. When spring cleaning a stock, proceed as follows. Wait until the morning is thoroughly warmed up and the bees flying freely. Then give the hive a few strong puffs of smoke in at the entrance, and lift it bodily forward about a yard. Now place the new hive in the place previously occupied by the old one, seeing that it is firmly footed and quite vertical. Go to the old hive, remove all coverings, and carefully scrape the tops of the brood frames clean of all propolis or bee glue and brace comb, using the painter's scraping tool and driving it steadily along the length of each frame until all are cleaned. Great care should here be exercised to avoid crushing any of the bees. This done, the frames with adhering bees should be lifted out one by one and placed in the new brood nest in exactly the same order which they previously occupied. Now cover the frames with a square of new, unbleached calico, bed ticking or similar strong tough cloth, and pile over this as many squares of warm woolen material. Old blanket or carpet serves this purpose admirably, as will suffice to keep the stock thoroughly warm. Go back to the old brood nest now, and if any bees remain in it, crawling about the floor and sides, shake them out in front of the entrance of the new dwelling, upon a board as described for swarm hiving on page 17. Now carry the old hive indoors, where it should be drastically cleaned within, being first scraped and then either scrubbed out with plenty of soap and hot water, or carefully toasted throughout by means of a painter's blow lamp. Finally, give it a coat, or better still, 2 coats, of good paint outside, when it will be ready to contain stock number 2. Although in England the main honey flow cannot be counted upon to last much more than 6 or 7 weeks at the most, in districts where there are many willows and sallows, a good quantity of nectar is often obtained by the bees from these sources as early as March. Preparations for exploiting the honey harvest should therefore be well in train before this time. A beekeeper may either elect to go in for comb honey production, or he may decide to harvest his honey in bottle form. To the man with only 1 or 2 hives, the first is by far the best, indeed the only practicable method. With bottle honey, unless the very wasteful and expensive system of crushing the honeycombs be adopted, certain apparatus for extracting the contents of the honey frames is essential. This means no inconsiderable outlay, which is justified only when the apiary consists of half a dozen hives or more. Comb or section honey may be produced in any quantity, large or small, with practically no additional outlay beyond the cost of the racks and their furniture. The best section rack is that wherein the section boxes are wedged up from one side as well as from the end. This form of rack is now made by practically all the bee appliance manufacturers. The novice's first attempt at comb honey production will probably be made with racks already furnished and ready to be put into the hive, but thereafter he will naturally prepare his own racks. The white basswood sections are delivered in the flat, to be folded by the beekeeper. It will be seen that 3 of the corners are indicated by transverse grooves which all but penetrate the thickness of the wood. The 4th corner is an ordinary dovetail joint. In folding these sections, great care is needed to prevent breakage of the grooved corners. It will pay to give each flat section a wipe with a damp sponge on the reverse side at every groove before bending into box form, otherwise they may be broken. This is specially desirable in dry weather. These sections are of various patterns, but the best for the small beekeeper is that known as the 2-way split top. The 4-way section, that in which passages for the bees are provided horizontally as well as vertically throughout the rack, would seem theoretically to be more accessible to the bees. But in practice, no difference in the time taken to complete the rack of sections is noticeable, while the 2-way has undoubtedly one advantage. The finished section looks as if it contained a larger block of honeycomb. This is actually no more than an optical illusion, the 2 forms of section averaging the same weight. But when one comes to sell honey, the point is appreciable. The dividers, the pieces of tin or thin wood placed between the rows of sections, are necessary to secure flatness in the comb. The wax foundation used with these sections should be the thinnest and purest obtainable, and full-size squares of it should always be employed. A cardinal rule in good beekeeping is, don't skimp your foundation, either in honey racks or in brood nests. The use of what are called starters, small pieces or strips instead of full sheets, is a proved penny-wise and pound-foolish policy. The full sheet in a honey frame means a more quickly completed comb just at the time when speedy production is most vital. The full sheet of worker-size foundation in a brood frame means not only saving of time, but it also limits the amount of drone comb constructed in the hive, and so tends to keep down the drone population, always excessive where natural comb building is permitted. Starters absolutely encourage the building of surplus drone comb. To obtain section honey in perfection, racial vigour and great strength of population are essential, as only strong stocks in high fettle can get the sections drawn out, filled and sealed as quickly as is necessary to make the most of the honey flow. Also, speed of production is needed in order that the sections may be early removed from the hive, and thus the snow-white purity of the wood and comb cappings be preserved. Sections left long on a hive are bound to lose their fresh appearance owing to the continual traffic of the bees. When supplying a hive with a second rack of sections, this should always be placed underneath the first, the right time to do so being when the first rack is a little more than half filled. Take care never to let the bees get restricted for storage space. A third or even a fourth rack may be given, always next to the brood chamber, so long as work is going well forward in the racks already on the hive. But one must also try to avoid being left at the close of the season with a great many sections only partially filled. The best system is to use new sections throughout, only when making up the first 2 racks. Do not wait until the first racks are sealed to the very corners before removal, but take them off when the majority of the sections are finished. The uncompleted sections are then placed with some new ones in subsequent racks, and as the season passes, fewer and fewer new ones are given until the last racks consist wholly of incomplete sections returned to the hives to be finished. By this method it is generally possible to reduce to a minimum the number of imperfect sections left to be carried over until the following year. There are 2 ways of dealing with these unfinished sections. They may be done up just as they are in paper parcels and put away in some dry, warm place out of the reach of vermin, being used in the succeeding spring for making up the earliest racks. So employed, they are extremely useful, for they serve to attract the bees into the supers when new sections would be ignored. 2 drawbacks to this plan must be noted. The wood of the section will have inevitably lost its freshness and so possibly its saleability, and the new honey may be of a different colour from the old, thus giving the section a piebald appearance when finished. The latter fault may be avoided by extracting the honey from the sections before they are put away for the winter. See page 32. With all its difficulties, however, comb honey production will ever remain the favourite method of working hives with the majority of beekeepers, and there is no doubt that honey eaten in the comb has a peculiar delicacy of flavour and aroma which it does not retain after extraction and bottling. On the other hand, a considerably larger yield of honey can be obtained from the hives when they are worked exclusively for bottle honey on the modern machine extraction system, because the combs have their contents removed and are then returned to the hives to be refilled by the bees. Thus all the time occupied in making fresh comb is saved just when time is most precious, during the height of the honey flow. Only one super rack is strictly necessary for each hive when run honey is the sole desideratum. This rack contains 10 comb frames of the same pattern and length as those used in the brood nest, but commonly only of a depth of 5½ inches instead of 8½ inches as with the brood frame. These are known as shallow frames. Racks of these frames should always have a queen excluder between them and the brood nest below. Otherwise the queen is pretty sure to go up and lay eggs in them. This is not so likely with racks of sections. Indeed, some notable producers of section honey state that they never use queen excluders at any time. The common experience, however, is that queens do sometimes invade section supers and spoil a great deal of honey which would otherwise be saleable. Don't omit the excluder under any circumstances, is therefore good advice for a beginner. The best procedure in run honey work is as follows. Have at least half a dozen hives equipped for this branch of beekeeping, but it is better to have more still, so that a good-sized batch of completely sealed comb frames may be ready for removal each time the beekeeper goes his round. It is the central combs that get finished first. The operator should have a carrying box, or even a light box barrow on wheels, made with hinged lid, the box being quite bee-proof when closed, and having bee escapes in the lid. This is filled with frames of empty comb, or with new frames fitted with wired worker foundation if no drawn-out combs are available. Every few days during the honey flow, more or less frequently according to the rate in which nectar is coming in and the number of stocks, the beekeeper goes the round of his hives, taking out the full frames and putting empty ones in their places. The roof of the hive is removed, the quilts covering the honey rack are generally turned back, smoke being puffed between the frames as they come into view. This smoke serves to drive most of the bees downward off the comb. Any combs seen to be fully sealed are now lifted out one by one, what bees remain upon them being shaken off by a sudden downward jerk or brushed off by a stiff feather. The full frames are then put into the box, and empty frames used to fill the gap in the honey rack. The hive is quickly closed up, and the beekeeper passes to the next stock. In this way, if upwards of half a dozen hives are being worked for run honey, and 2 or 3 combs are taken from each, enough will have been secured for the average man to deal with single-handed at one operation. The honey should always be extracted immediately after taking the frames from the hives. It is then in a warm fluid condition and will leave the combs much more readily and completely than if allowed to get cold. Herein will be seen the wisdom of having a sufficient number of stocks given over to run honey production to enable the beekeeper to collect in a single round enough full frames for, say, an entire afternoon's work in the extracting shed. Apart from the fact that the expense of the extracting outfit is not warranted where only a few hives are kept, it is never worth the trouble to prepare the outfit and to have to clean it up again after use, merely to get the honey out of a few combs. For honey extraction, there will be needed, first, a good centrifugal machine. This consists of a circular vat of heavily tinned plate with an internal revolving mechanism to hold 2 or more comb frames. The mechanism is rotated by means of gearing above, and the combs, after having their cell cappings removed, being rapidly whirled round, the honey is thrown out of the cells against the sides of the vat, whence it runs down and is eventually drawn off by a tap or honey gate at the bottom. These extracting machines are of various patterns, sizes and prices. The large professional honeyman will need a machine holding many combs at a time, and it may even pay him to have it power-driven. But for the ordinary beekeeper, a machine worked by hand and capable of holding 2 frames will simply suffice. The extractor, however, should always be geared so that 1 turn of the handle produces 2 turns of the internal contrivance holding the frames. Otherwise it will be very difficult and laborious to get up sufficient speed to eject the honey. The beeman will also require a good uncapping knife. That shaped somewhat like a bricklayer's trowel and known as a bingham will be found very suitable, and it is a great convenience to have 2 of them. These knives should be kept quite sharp, and they should be used both hot and wet. Some sort of heating apparatus for them will therefore be necessary. A tall tin with a heating stove or lamp underneath for boiling water, in which the knives may stand when not actually in use, will serve the purpose admirably. What is known as an uncapping tray will also be needed. This may be any deep, wide vessel, such as an enamelled iron bowl with a strong grid over its mouth. When extracting, proceed as follows. The work should be carried out in a room or shed with plenty of light and air, but from which bees can be rigorously excluded. The best system is to have a hut near the apiary, used only for work of this kind, its doors and windows being fitted with frames of muslin or wire gauze. Get the whole batch of combs to be dealt with into the hut, and make sure that the place is bee-proof before commencing operations. The work can be done by 1, but an assistant to turn the handle is very desirable. Take the first of the frames, letting its end rest upon the grid of the uncapping tray, and holding it nearly vertical, the left hand firmly gripping its topmost lug. Now withdraw one of the knives from the heating tank, and leaning the frame a little forward, try to slice off the whole sheet of cappings from one side of the comb at a single sliding cut. This will be found rather difficult at first, but as soon as the knack has been acquired, it will come quite easy. Don't cut away more of the honey than you can help. The ideal thing to aim at is the removal of the entire area of cell cappings in a single sheet, this falling upon the grid, any honey adhering to it draining through to the vessel below. When one side of the comb has been thus dealt with, reverse the frame and treat the other side in the same fashion. One knife should uncap a whole frame, but if it is inclined to drag, use a fresh knife for the second side. Having uncapped 2 frames, place them into the cages of the machine in such a way that when the internal mechanism is revolving, the frames go round bottom bar first. This is important, as otherwise the honey will not leave the comb as readily and cleanly as it should do. All comb cells have a slight upward inclination, and this slant of the cells will cause the honey to hang up unless the frame be inserted in the rotating cages in the manner described. With a moderate-sized batch of frames, such as I assume is now under treatment, there will probably be enough space in the lower part of the extractor to hold all the honey obtained without impeding the action of the cages. In this case, the honey may be left in the machine, after taking out the revolving mechanism, and allowed to stand all night for settling and clearing. Next day it will be found quite practicable to draw it off into the screw-cap jars in which run honey is ordinarily sold, without further manipulation. It should not be necessary to strain it until almost the last pound or two is coming away, when there is sure to be an amount of wax particles which must be intercepted. But if a larger number of combs are to be extracted, yielding more honey than the lower part of the vat will hold, some sort of vessel will be needed to which the honey may be temporarily transferred. Large tins called honey ripeners, holding about 100 weight and fitted with a tap below, are specially made for this purpose, and may be obtained quite cheaply from most bee appliance dealers. The proper way to deal with the emptied combs is to make them up into racks and put them onto the hives to be cleaned up. This should be done on the evening of the same day on which they have been extracted. But these racks of wet frames must not be given to the bees in the same way as they would be given if they contained dry, clean combs. Such a proceeding would be very likely to set the hives in an uproar. The racks must always be given over what is called a porter escape board. This is a framed square of wood having a device in its centre which allows bees to pass down, but will not permit them to come up. At one side of the board there is a circular hole about an inch in diameter, which is closed by a tin slide capable of being opened from the outside. The escape boards should be got into position upon the hive selected to receive the racks of wet frames, this being done any time during the day. Then after sunset, when all bees are in for the night, the racks are brought out and quietly placed over the escape board. The tin slides are then withdrawn, and the bees will soon find their way into the supers and clean up the combs without any disturbance being occasioned. In the morning, the bypasses can be closed again, when all bees in the supers will eventually go down through the non-return device in centre of board, leaving the racks empty and ready to be removed to the comb store, where they remain until wanted as exchanges at the next extracting operation. As I have previously said, the great majority of beekeepers who work for bottle honey use the shallow frame in their extracting supers, and experience proves that this size of frame serves the purpose very well. But the larger standard frame, as specified by the British Beekeepers Association, that having the same width as the shallow frame, but having a depth of 8.5 inches instead of 5.5 inches, can also be employed for honey storage without much extra difficulty. And as, in my own practice, I use only the large frame for all purposes, both in the brood nest and in the honey chambers, I wish here to explain why I do so, because it naturally leads me to a topic I have very much at heart. This is the special method of working hives for run honey production, which I have been following for many years past, and which, while making no pretensions to an intensive system, does claim to be very suitable for the busy country dweller with no superfluity of time to give to his bees. Writers on bee culture, for at least half a century back, to my own certain knowledge, have constantly laid emphasis on the great desirability of reducing the swarming habit of bees to a minimum, if large honey takes are to be secured. Swarm prevention has been laid down as the royal road to successful beekeeping from the profit-earning point of view, and the efforts of bee specialists throughout the country have been largely concentrated on devising systems by which stocks can be induced to give up swarming and so maintain their strength for the purpose of honey getting. Very rightly it has been asserted that one stock of bees of good strength will produce in a season much more honey than two colonies having collectively the same strength. But how is swarming to be prevented? No doubt a great deal can be done in the desired direction by those having the leisure to devote to the matter. But what can be accomplished by the average busy man, with maybe a living to get from a small piece of land and his time, capital and energy spread out over many other activities besides the care of his few hives? He cannot afford to requeen his stocks with expensive queen bees bred through long years from supposed non-swarming strains. And he has no time to set about the many manipulations recommended as preventatives, or at least deterrents, of the swarming habit. The difficulty is farther complicated by the fact that of recent years the country has been inundated with Dutch bees, who, though immensely prolific, hard-working and resistant of disease, are notoriously heavy swarmers. Moreover, one must ask oneself this question: is it really sound policy to endeavour to restrict, even if one cannot prevent, this instinct of the honey bee to swarm, seeing that the swarming habit is natural in bees, and is their ordained method for the dissemination of their race? In trying to induce our stocks to go against nature, are we not also going against our own interests as keepers of bees? It was this aspect of the matter, together with the conviction born of experience, that swarm prevention was only possible as the result of an infinity of trouble not really worth while for the average man, which led me to adopt the system now to be briefly described. Instead of trying to abolish swarming in my apiary, I now work to encourage the issue of very early and very heavy swarms by every means in my power. These swarms are hived at once in brood nests containing 10 fully drawn-out standard combs, and the swarm hive is then put upon the stand of the mother stock, the latter being removed to a new location some distance away. Thus all flying bees who did not join the swarm come back to it now, and so serve materially to augment its population. At the same time, the swarm is given a super containing 10 more standard frames over a queen excluder, these being new frames fitted with full sheets of properly wired worker foundation. The situation created is just this. The swarm queen finds herself in possession of 10 empty standard brood combs, so that she has unlimited scope for egg-laying. Among the swarm bees, those that are comb builders crowd up at once into the super and begin to draw out the foundation, while those that are foragers set off into the fields to gather nectar for the combs thus building. all the natural propensities of the swarm are provided for, and if the season turn out anything like a good one, the swarm stock is sure to prove itself a profitable concern. The mother hive may either be deprived of all its queen cells and given a fertile laying queen, when it will soon settle down to work and render a good account of itself, or it may be left to its own devices, any after swarms which it may throw off being returned to it on the evening of their day of issue. In my own practice, these after swarms are returned not to the hive they left, but to the swarm which previously originated from it, the strength of the latter being thus still further increased. Provided the honey flow is still at its height, the various lots of bees seem to unite quite amicably. Don't bother about the young queens, one of which will accompany each of these after swarms. The stock will effectively dispose of them. In good seasons, the mother hives, even when thus depleted, may generally be counted upon to give some surplus honey, but it will be seen that the system here sketched depends for its honey yield on the swarms and not on the stocks. The plan works particularly well with Dutch bees, their heavy swarming propensities and immense prolificness rendering them peculiarly adaptable to such a method. The one drawback to the system lies in the fact that it requires 2 seasons to get into full working order, as a stock of fully drawn-out combs in standard frames is necessary to begin with. But thereafter, the frames drawn out in the supers of one year will be carried over the winter to be used for furnishing the brood nests of the swarms in the following spring. There is, incidentally, considerable advantage in thus having all brood frames built out in honey chambers. The combs are carried right down to the wood of the bottom bars and sideways to the side bars, whereas a comb drawn out in a brood nest always comes short of the lower bar by half an inch or so, and there is a similar space left by the bees for some distance up each side. The result is that though the frame is the same size in each case, the one contains a considerably greater number of cells than the other. End of section 3. Section 4 of Beekeeping Do's and Don'ts by Tickner Edwardes. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Autumn and Winter Management. Autumn for the bee master begins directly the season's nectar flow has come to an end and the last honey super has been removed from the hives. The date varies according to the district. If there be a good stretch of heatherland within a mile or so of the apiary, the foragers may be kept busy right to the end of July, or sometimes well on into August. Where heather is plentiful, even though it be several miles off, out of reach of the bees in the ordinary way, it will usually well repay the trouble involved in taking the hives to it. What is called heather honey, however, is the exclusive product of the true heather plant or ling, not of the heath, sometimes spoken of as bell heather. It is important to know how to distinguish these. The heath is the bell or pitcher-shaped blossom that covers whole provinces at this time with intensely brilliant purple. There is honey of sorts to be made from it, but its quality is not to be compared with that from the ling, whose inflorescence cannot be called brilliant at all. The ling bears an infinity of small spiky blooms of a sombre washed-out pink, whose combined effect is very inferior to that of the bell heather. But the honey from it is excellent, and so dense that it is useless to attempt its extraction from the comb by the centrifugal machine. Only hives supered with sections, therefore, should be taken to the moors, if the wasteful system of crushing the combs is to be avoided. But in ordinary districts, where neither ling nor bell heather is available, the nectar flow very seldom lasts beyond the end of June at the outside. As soon as it becomes evident that the supply has come to an end, the beekeeper should begin seriously to consider what is before him. If there can be said to be a cardinal secret in the achievement of success in apiculture, it lies undoubtedly in the proper preparation of the hives for wintering. To winter well, and come out in the following spring strong and ready for another season's work, a stock should go into winter quarters possessed of a young, vigorous, fertile queen, a large population consisting almost wholly of late-bred bees, and a store of good, ripe, sealed honey weighing about 25 pounds to 30 pounds. Unless the winter population consists mainly of young bees, the early batches of brood in the following year will not have enough nurse bees to care for them, while shortage of stores at the same period will mean that brood raising will be undertaken by the stock in but half-hearted fashion, and progress will be slow in consequence. To ensure that sufficient sealed honey be left in the brood nests for wintering, an inspection should be made when the last supers are being removed. If the season has been a good one, nearly every brood comb should have its upper part filled with honey forming a sort of arch, and in 5 or 6 of the central frames at least, the lower region of the comb should still contain brood in various stages of development. Probably also the outermost frames on each side will be filled, or nearly filled, with honey, 1 or 2 of them perhaps being solid blocks from wood to wood. Now here the novice will be beset by a great temptation. It would be so easy to take out these fat combs and extract them, so adding materially to the honey take for the year. And yet that brings us perhaps to the most imperious "don't" in the whole of this little book. The honey that the bees store in the super racks is yours to the last ounce, but always leave the bees the whole of what they have stored in their brood chambers. Beekeepers do not sufficiently realise the importance of wintering their stocks on plenty of sound, mature honey. On a first thought, it may seem a clever move to take the honey worth perhaps 2 shillings per pound and feed to the bees in its place sugar syrup, which can be made for 6d. But I am convinced nature's own provender turns out much the cheaper in the long run. It must be remembered that on the maintenance of the high condition of the queen bee and her helpers throughout the winter and early spring depend the vigour and stamina of the future generations, and I believe the deterioration that one so often observes in the spring condition of stocks of bees is largely caused by inferior artificial winter food. Of course, after a very bad season, autumn may find the stocks with very little sealed honey in the brood chambers, in which emergency, if there be no natural food available for the purpose, the necessary weight of winter stores must be made up by sugar syrup. In this case, The artificial food should be given as rapidly as possible to the required amount, not later than the end of September, when all stocks should be packed warmly down with plenty of thick woolen quilts and left absolutely undisturbed, if possible, until well on into the succeeding spring. Indeed, the great test of good beemanship is just this ability of the beeman and his bees to forget all about each other during the close season, the former sure that his charges, well provisioned and snug in a warm dry hive, will be thoroughly able to take care of themselves. It has been said that, to winter well, all stocks must be strong. If any weak lots exist in the apiary, they should either be united to other and more populous colonies, or joined up together in twos or even threes. This work is best carried through in the early autumn directly the honey flow is over. The lots to be combined should be gradually brought together side by side, moving them no more than 2 or 3 feet on each day of flying weather. Then, choosing a fine, mild day, go through the stocks, selecting the frames containing the most brood, and put the best 10 in one of the brood chambers together, alternating the combs of the 2 lots. As a precaution to ensure amicable union, each of the frames, as it is lifted up crowded with bees, may be thoroughly dusted with flour from a dredger, or sprayed with a scent atomizer. The object of this is to give the different families the same appearance and odour, and so promote friendly relationships. But in 9 cases out of 10, a good fumigating from the ordinary smoker will provide all that is necessary, and this, of course, they will have had before the hives were opened. In joining up stocks of bees in this way, one or other of the queens may be searched for and removed, the youngest and most vigorous being allowed to assume leadership of the combined forces. But if there is no difference in the value of the queens, it is not strictly necessary to go to this trouble. They may just be turned in together when it will be a case of the weakest going to the wall. When selecting the 10 best frames for the united colony, regard must be had to the presence of stores as well as brood. With a little practice, the beekeeper will soon be able to judge by the eye alone the contents of a given amount of honeycomb, and so be able to arrive at an estimate of what is needed. Next to strength of population and a larder filled with the right sort of food, the successful wintering of bees depends on their being housed in thoroughly weather and cold-proof hives. Don't have anything to do with hives, any of whose walls consist of a single thickness of wood, unless you intend to supply them with a second and outer casing when winter comes. It is true that bees contained in single-wall hives will survive the ordinary English winter and build up again moderately well in the spring. But it is always at the expense of much vitality and consumption of stores that would have been saved had their hives been scientifically constructed. The double-walled and double-floored hive, with or without packing material, is better for bees in every way. Not only is such a hive heat retentive, but it defies what is the chief enemy of bee life in the quiescent time of the close season, damp. The brood nest of a double-walled hive will remain dry when the interior of single-walled hives may be reeking with moisture. The true reason for this is likely to be overlooked by the novice. It is not that moisture penetrates from without, although that is quite possible with hives made from thin, poorly seasoned timber. It is that single walls always remain cold, and the warm vapour incessantly given off by the cluster of bees precipitates its moisture on these walls instead of passing harmlessly out of the hive entrance as it should do. The inner surfaces of the brood chamber being thus rendered permanently damp, and cold into the bargain, these communicate their chill sodden condition to everything they enclose. Stores of honey absorb the moisture, the combs sweat, fermentation often sets in, and dysentery may break out in the colony. The stores of pollen become mildewed and therefore spoilt. The winter cluster of bees, with the queen in its midst, feels the general chill humidity of its surroundings. Its temperature falls, and the bees have to consume more of the deteriorated stores to maintain the necessary warmth. This means, at the very least, an expenditure of vitality that would not occur under proper conditions. And when the time comes for the stock to get busy in the spring, its members are already half worn out by winter difficulties, instead of being rested and ripe and eager for the task ahead of it. Probably half the mortality which occurs among stocks of bees is directly due to neglect or ignorance of this housing problem. Good hives will not by themselves ensure success in apiculture, other things being absent, but there is no doubt they will go a very long way towards securing the success we all desire. To autumn belongs most properly an operation which also bears very directly on the successful management of bees. This is the requeening of those stocks known to be headed by a mother bee past her second year of full activity, or where a colony has shown undesirable traits such as lack of good working qualities or bad temper. The requeening of a stock is always attended by a certain amount of risk, as the bees may resent the introduction of the stranger and either severely maul her or even kill her outright. But if the old queen be removed at least 24 hours beforehand, and the new queen be protected by some device for another day or so after her insertion, the stock will usually accept her without any trouble. There are many different ways of contriving this, but one of the best of these is the old plan of using a queen cage, which may be merely a small cylinder of perforated zinc, closed at the upper end, but open at the lower end, this end, however, being plugged with half an inch of stiff candy. The cage containing the queen bee is pushed down between two of the central combs and the hive closed. The bees of the colony will set to work to eat away the candy, and the queen be thus eventually released. But by the time this happens, the stranger will have acquired the general odour of the hive, and will be allowed to assume duty with the rest without opposition. When requeening, it is sound policy to obtain queens of guaranteed fertility and good strain from some reliable queen bee breeder at a distance, and so import new blood into the apiary. There is a danger, prevalent indeed in early spring, but still more likely to evince itself in autumn, particularly just at the conclusion of the nectar flow, which the beekeeper must carefully guard himself against. This is the tendency of hives to rob each other. It is usually the weak colonies which are thus raided by the strong, and this forms an additional reason for allowing no weak stocks to exist in the apiary. When a hive is being attacked, the first effective device to employ is to create an artificial rainstorm all over it and round it by means of a watering pot with a fine rose. This will temporarily drive off the aggressing host. Then close the entrance of the hive to about half an inch, place a double handful of loose hay upon the alighting board, and hang over the face of the hive a cloth sprinkled freely with carbolic acid. In addition to these deterrents, it is a good plan, if possible, to enclose the hive in a sort of tent of netting or wire gauze. This should stand about 6 feet high, but should be open at the top. The bees of the hive will find their way in and out, but the robbers will be effectually excluded. In cases of robbing, however, prevention is always much easier than cure. Carelessness on the part of the beekeeper is nearly always its exciting cause. The interior of a hive may have been unduly exposed, or syrup spilt on the ground when filling feeders, or scraps of comb, propolis, etc., allowed to lie about the vicinity instead of being punctiliously removed at the end of a manipulation. All these are incentives to robbing, especially in autumn, and it is a wise plan at this season to defer all necessary operations such as feeding and removal of supers until the close of the day. End of section 4. Section 5 of Beekeeping Do's and Don'ts by Tickner Edwardes. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Diseases of bees. So far, I have said nothing about disease in bee life, assuming throughout that the principles of management described will be understood to refer only to stocks of bees in a normal, healthy state. My reason for thus leaving to the last the consideration of bee diseases is twofold. In the first place, that it is the right position for them in respect of importance. Taking the whole country together, there is little doubt that the number of diseased colonies is at the present time small in comparison with the number of healthy colonies, and as enlightened modern methods of beekeeping gain ascendancy, and the old let alone ignorant hive owners are weeded out, this proportion must still further improve. Two facts in my own experience are worth attention in support of this view. First, as bee editor of an important weekly journal with a sale approximating 250,000 in all parts of Great Britain, I am called upon to give advice on matters of bee disease in cases averaging not more than 6 or 8 a week. And second, I have not had a single case of disease among my own bees for over 10 years, though the hives have been located in a district wherein formerly disease was largely prevalent. I think these two facts tend to prove that the risk of losses from disease in apiculture is actually not very great. And my second reason for leaving the consideration of bee diseases to the last is that I did not wish unduly to alarm and possibly discourage the prospective beekeeper. No doubt, owing principally to sensational paragraphs as to disastrous epidemics in bee life, which have been appearing at intervals for many years past in the daily press, the public has acquired a greatly exaggerated notion of the real state of affairs. It is true that the honey bee is subject to several diseases which annually cause the extinction of a certain number of stocks. One in particular, which will be familiar to all under its popular name of Isle of Wight disease, has had a remarkable recrudescence of recent years, and it is a fact that many thousands of stocks have succumbed to it. But it is equally a fact that Isle of Wight, as an epidemic, is now a thing of the past. The disease still lingers here and there in the country, and probably never will be entirely stamped out. Yet it cannot be too widely known alike among would-be beekeepers and the public generally that an ailment, now known as acarine disease, is no longer the scourge it undoubtedly was at one time, and that no one need any longer be deterred by it from adventuring their little capital in what may once more be styled one of the most pleasant and profitable among our minor rural industries. In a little book of this nature, which claims to be merely a collection of hints on apiculture, it is obviously impracticable to do more than give a few details of the principal bee diseases so that they may be recognised by the novice, and to indicate the most generally accepted means either of prevention or cure. Bee diseases group themselves under two heads: those affecting the adult bee and those attacking the bee in its larval and pupal stage. Of the first class, that now called acarine disease is by far the most prevalent, though no doubt other ailments have been confused with it both in the present and the past. It is an affection of the respiratory system attacking workers, drones and queens alike. A minute parasitic mite enters the breathing tubes of the bee, and there breeding and multiplying eventually chokes up the air passages and the bee dies. In its advanced stage, the disease is easily recognised by the fact that many bees lose the power of flight and are seen crawling about on the ground where they have fallen on attempting to leave the hive. Generally, it is not until this condition of things becomes evident that the inexperienced beekeeper has any suspicion that anything is wrong with the hive, and, unluckily, it is then generally too late to save the stock. But if treatment be undertaken in the early stages, on the first invasion of the acarine mite, there is a good reason to hope for the recovery of the bees. Unfortunately, it is impossible to detect these early stages of the disease without the use of the microscope, when, on dissection of a few specimens, the presence of the invading parasite can be easily ascertained. Good results have followed the adoption of sulphur fumigation, powdered sulphur being dusted over the corrugated brown paper before this is rolled up for use in the smoker. This may be very gently applied at intervals of a few hours, the bees being carefully watched and the treatment temporarily discontinued should any obvious ill effect on the stock ensue. It must be remembered that sulphur in excess will destroy bee life, so great caution with this substance is necessary. Another and much safer method of treatment for this disease in the hands of the novice is the following, and I strongly recommend its employment in all cases where acarine is known or suspected to exist. Remove all coverings from the brood nest and lay over the frames a square of clean old calico. Sprinkle this sparsely but evenly with oil of peppermint, and then cover up with several layers of warm woolen material. The sprinkling may be renewed every other day, or daily, if no deleterious effect on the bees evince itself. But see that it is the British preparation of oil of peppermint that your chemist sells you. Don't be fubbed off with the foreign substitute, which is distinctly not as good. Among diseases attacking the immature bee, that known as foul brood is the most important. There are two distinct diseases to which this name is commonly applied, and these are due to different organisms. The one, known as European foul brood, destroys the young larvae of the bee when in the feeding stage. That known as American foul brood effects the destruction of the pupae after the cells are sealed over. In both forms of the disease, recognition is fairly easy by reason of the unhealthy appearance of the combs, either with open cells containing dead and putrefying larvae, or, if sealed, the cappings being sunken and many broken. In slight cases of European foul brood, the disease will frequently disappear as the summer season advances. But with the much more serious and very malignant American foul brood, this cannot be hoped for. The likelier remedial measure in cases of foul brood consists in giving the bees an entirely new house and furniture. The hive should be moved away, and a fresh, clean hive, fully furnished with frames, put in its place and prepared with an extension of a lighting board as for the reception of a swarm. Then take out the combs of the old hive with the adhering bees, and shake the bees off in front of the entrance of the new hive, allowing them to run in. When all the frames have been thus treated, close the hive up snug and warm, and at once burn or bury all the diseased comb frames. Place a feeder with syrup upon the stock, and leave it to build out a new set of combs and start life for itself afresh. The only other ailment of bee life which the novice is likely to fall in with is dysentery, and this is not properly a distinct disease. It is due mainly to unwholesome food, or to fermentation of stores frequently caused by a damp hive, and here the remedy obviously lies in the administration of good food and the substitution of a properly designed hive for the faulty one. But the great safeguard against every kind of disease in bee life is the adoption of sound methods of management, such as I have endeavoured to describe in the foregoing pages. Keep nothing but strong stocks headed by vigorous young queens of good strain, and keep them dry and warm at all seasons, and you will have little to fear from disease of any kind. End of section 5. End of Beekeeping Do's and Don'ts by Tickner Edwardes.